Final Fantasy VII Remake has sold over 5 million copies, and it is an experience. From the moment you select New Game in Remake, you're pulled into this epic story that starts with some kind of bird leading us into Midgar, which is the setting for literally the entire game. While the bird may be a little random, it's definitely an improvement over the way the original game's opening cutscene started. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In order to do this review justice, I played Remake 3 times, including twice on hard mode, and then I went back and I played the full original game for a second time since the 90s. I played through Crisis Core, I watched the Advent Children movie again, and even watched hours of the story from Dirge of Cerberus, which I did not play because I, let's face it, suck at shooter games.
I've got skills.
Buckle up. This is going to be one thorough deep dive full of spoilers from a completionist who has geeked out on pretty much every Final Fantasy game to hit the United States since I was a kid. And even if my mom ends up being the only one who actually watches this review, and she won't have any idea what I'm talking about, hey, making this review is kind of nerd euphoria for me, so I consider that a win. I'll start by saying that Final Fantasy VII Remake is filled with both the awesome and the awkward. And before I talk about which A word wins out, we need to take a look at its history. The journey to Remake began with the release of the original Final Fantasy VII JRPG in 1997. It was my second Final Fantasy experience. I actually ended up playing 8 first when I was a teenager, and then I worked my way backwards through the franchise, so that 7 was my second Final Fantasy experience. And because 7 was such a success among fans, the sequel film Advent Children was released 8 years later in 2005, and only 2 weeks after that, a short anime film called Last Order followed. Then the shooter game about Vincent Valentine, Dirge of Cerberus, in 2006. Then the prequel game about Zack Fair called Crisis Core in 2007. And finally, 13 years later, Final Fantasy VII Remake, or at least the first part of it. As for parts 2, 3, 4, 15, 3096, who the heck knows? But the order of the release obviously doesn't match the story order, which looks like this. Crisis Core takes place first, spanning the 7 years before the original story, and the Last Order anime film is basically a snippet from the Crisis Core story. Crisis Core then basically leads right into the original game and simultaneously Remake, with the full original game story spanning only about a couple of months. Then 2 years later, Advent Children takes place, followed by the Dirge of Cerberus 1 year after that. Since this is a deep dive review, we're going to splatter you with clips full of spoilers for all of these, so you've been warned. Okay, let's jump in. Back to the opening of Remake. The opening cutscene serves 2 main purposes. It sets the scene of the game and introduces us to a very important character, Aerith, or Eris. No, you're not remembering that wrong. The original game first had her named as Eris, but then they changed it to Aerith because it sounds like Earth. Moving on. The developers didn't hesitate to pay some fan service while setting the stage, with some shot-for-shot mirror moments from the original game intro. And Final Fantasy fans pretty much freaked out when it was released in advance as a trailer and on the demo, because it really did encompass the vibe of the original game, but with a few steps up, of course, in the visual department when compared to the classic poly models. Then we meet the characters of Avalanche. First Biggs and Jesse, and then Wedge and Barrett. And through visual storytelling, we get a good sense of who they are and what they're doing without having to, read something or hear some monologue or suffer through some lengthy, poorly written dialogue or, read journal pages along the way or something. And the same goes for Cloud. We get a side glance at him on the moving train before he has his real entrance, which, by the way, has anyone else noticed how good Final Fantasy VII characters are at landing on the ground like Spider-Man? Now, since it basically took me almost as long to make this review as it took the developers to make the game, let's quickly go over the storyline of Remake in case it's been a while since you've played. So here's the fast version. Cloud is an elite ex-soldier working as a mercenary who was hired by an extreme environmentalist group called Avalanche to assist in breaking down the Shinra power grid systems that sustain the city of Midgar through eating up the planet's resources. His original one-time gig becomes an ongoing mission aside Avalanche supporters that include his childhood friend Tifa, who is now grown up and managing a bar in the slums underneath the elevated Sector 7 plate that houses the wealthier citizens of the city. After defeating a major enemy boss that physically propels him through the roof of a slum church, Cloud meets Aerith, a spunky flower peddler who isn't afraid to speak her mind or help her neighbors, who immediately hires him as a bodyguard to protect her against capture by the Turks, an FBI-style agency managed by Agent Legolas of the very company destroying the planet's resources. Aerith's authenticity is hypnotically attractive to Cloud, and he represses his feelings, along with repetitive visions of the ultra-enemy Sephiroth, as Aerith and Cloud join forces to rescue Tifa from a perverted, fat, rich guy in a ghetto version of Las Vegas. After some house hunting, stargazing, stage dancing, and dress wearing, Cloud and Aerith reach Tifa and confront the fat guy, who throws them into the sewers to die, but not before disclosing the plan to drop the Sector 7 section of the upper city plate onto the lower slums, which will inevitably kill everyone above or below it. So they rush through the sewers and a haunted train graveyard to Sector 7 to sound the alarm for the people to evacuate, and Cloud and Tifa climb never-ending stairs under gunfire, pausing for dramatic death scenes of friends along the way, until they reach Barrett and his stretched-out Jack Skellington tattoo at the top and try to beat up the Turks before they can activate the falling of the plate. Unsuccessful, they hop a makeshift zipline to safety as Sector 7 is destroyed behind them, and then they rush to Aerith's house where Aerith safely brought Barrett's adopted daughter before allowing herself to be captured by the Turks in exchange. Cloud and company learn there that Aerith is actually the lone survivor of the ancient and magical Cetra race, and head to Shinra headquarters to rescue her, where Tifa does gymnastics, they visit a museum, see a vision of Aerith's ancient race, avoid security detection with the help of an old mare, rescue Aerith, and team up with a talking dog creature to navigate the maze of a mad scientist named Hojo. As they fight through Hojo's lab, they notice an alien torso has disappeared, so they follow the pattern of cool purpley blood to a fight with the Shinra president, who dies, fight with a clone who looks like Sephiroth, who dies, but who also stabs Barrett, who dies, but then doesn't die, and then an annoying fight with the president's son, who doesn't die. They make their grand escape with Cloud on an over-the-top motorcycle, and the rest of the party in a wussy baby truck, and then they drive to the edge of the city, determined to destroy fate and rewrite their stories. In an epic battle, complete with bosses in primary colors, tornado rock jumping, and duking it out with Sephiroth, the team wins the fight and in turn reveals that not only is Biggs of Avalanche still alive after dying in the battle to save Sector 7, but a soldier named Zack didn't die either. That's the gist of it.
Hope everybody's warmed up.
Which brings me to the first big topic that I want to address. Storytelling. I have to say, it surprised me how consistently good the storytelling was throughout this game. Instead of hearing character monologues explaining plot points, or heaven forbid, having to read plot points from random journal pages or poetic stones scattered around the world, or leaving a lot of questions just plain unanswered, Remake developers put real time and planning into telling the story visually, and making sure, dare I say it, that it makes sense. It's not perfect, but it is a big step up. I'm a huge Final Fantasy fan, but I would be kidding myself if I didn't admit that typically every game starts out with good characters and what seems to be a coherent storyline with cool scenes and quality moments, but then by the time you've reached the end, you don't know what the heck is going on. Now, for those of you purists out there who study all the lore and the fan theories like you're about to take the LSAT, before you leave me a comment rivaling the blank of the Bible explaining why Final Fantasy storylines are incredibly clear to you, I'm just gonna say, for a normal human being, no.
It's simple, really.
Ambiguity is the enemy of storytelling, and too many important story details in Final Fantasies are often lost to long and unclear dialogue, or missed side quests, rushed exposure to important details, or even budget cuts where entire chunks of the story don't even make it into the game. That being said, I honestly expected the same convoluted story style in this game as we've seen in the past, especially knowing that the director of this game is also responsible for the loopy-doop plotlines of Kingdom Hearts and Advent Children. And me being an original connoisseur of Final Fantasy VII in the 90s, I know that even with a second shot at telling this story, the developers here would still have their work cut out for them. When I beat the original game, I remember thinking, hey, that was super cool and fun, and I'm a bit confused. But the storytelling in Remake is surprisingly clear, which is really saying something. A big part of that is probably because they get to tell the story over multiple games, who knows how many, instead of cramming it all into one, which makes it possible to flesh out the story moments that were originally maybe skimmed over in the original game, and they can really script out and clarify anything that could have been ambiguous. If you play the OG, the pieces of the plot are all pretty much there. You just have to be a completionist who is virtually memorizing everything you see in order to really grasp the whole thing, which can feel just about as exciting as doing chemistry homework. That's not to say that Remake developers don't have plenty of opportunities to screw this all up in future renditions of the game. But for now, I'm gonna say I remain cautiously optimistic. At least in this first installation of Remake, the plot, the scenes, the characters, action, and dialogue are all very well thought out for a Square Enix JRPG. I mean, sure, there was a lot of surviving falls from incredible distances. And a lot of last-minute ledge catching.
Tifa!
Barret!
But I guess if Hollywood can take those kinds of liberties, then so can Final Fantasy. Although, none of the falls were apparently as terrifying as this one.
Tifa! Oh shit!
I thought I was dead for sure.
But the storytelling is not the only thing that's good in Remake. I also think that the pacing is pretty good too. In Remake, the pacing changes throughout from moments of intensity and fighting to little puzzles to major story moments and so on and so forth. And it's actually its variety and pace that makes each change of pace really welcome and interesting. And while it isn't without some odd urgency push and pull, like the strange slowdown of pace at the train graveyard as though the party has suddenly forgotten that the plate could fall any minute, or the casual walking around openly in the Shinra building after eliminating a parking garage full of Shinra fighters. Apparently nobody's looking for the people who did that. But other than moments like that, Remake's pacing is, as a whole, quite the contrast from what I mentioned in my Final Fantasy XV review, where the game is paced very slowly until the last few chapters where you feel like you're suddenly shot out of a rocket. Now, that doesn't mean that all the chapters in Remake are created equal, but the slower moving chapters are necessary in order to juxtapose against the faster ones. Personally, my two favorite chapters out of the 18 were Chapter 4 and Chapter 9, though there were a lot of good chapters, but those are my favorite. So Chapter 4, just to remind you, is when Cloud goes with Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie to Jessie's house, and then we learn about her backstory and her father, and then they break into the Shinra base to steal supplies. The pacing and the diversity of that chapter are awesome. It starts with this fast motorcycle minigame, and I'm not a huge fan of minigames, as I'll talk about later, but it was fine. And then it slows down for some story and some character building at Jessie's house. And then it picks up the pace with some super sweet cutscenes and battle mechanics as Biggs and Wedge help Cloud take out the enemy, and then it punctuates itself with some humor between the characters and ends in that final parachute jump down to Sector 7. Now that's good gameplay. And in Chapter 9, while I'm not in love with the mechanical arm puzzles, I appreciate the developers' efforts, especially considering that they were able to turn this simple frame from the original game into a sort of minigame with diverse mechanics. But Chapter 9 also has the nice park scene with Cloud and Aerith, as well as Wall Market, which I keep wanting to call Walmart for some reason. And then it also has the Colosseum and what is by far one of the best parts of the game, which is the Honeybee Inn. Now, when I played the original game as a somewhat sheltered teenager, I remember being mortified by what a perv Don Corneo was. So I couldn't help but be a little wary and apprehensive about how the developers would handle sleazy wall market in 2020. And thank goodness I was in for a delightful surprise. Having the stoic soldier uncomfortably bust out some stellar dance moves on the stage and then leave wearing a dress was insanely fun. My brother and his husband, who played Remake before I did, made me live stream my reaction to playing that specific scene for the first time because they knew it was coming and they knew what I would think about it, which I loved it. Are you for real? What? What? This is hilarious.
I love it.
And that really does bring up another great thing about Remake, which is the tone. So if you go back to the original game, the tone is actually pretty dark. Character conversations are apprehensive, and you really spend the bulk of the story reminded that you're on the tragic brink of utter destruction at all times. In contrast, Remake takes the same plot points and the same themes, and then it lightens them with humor, or it adjusts them just slightly to keep them a little bit more fun and interesting, instead of constantly foreboding or even disturbing.
So that's where we have to climb?
What if it comes apart while we're up there?
For instance, the Honeybee Inn, again, which is a brothel in the original game, is instead a nightclub in Remake that doesn't really take itself too seriously. Thank goodness. It's disturbing enough to see scandalous polygons, let alone mo-capped humanoids who push you into a psychological uncanny valley. Some of the dark tones of the original game would just be too dark in my opinion, or even too gross to directly translate to the modern game, so I'm really glad they didn't go there. Another example is with the plate falling. So in the original, if you remember, no one in Sector 7 is warned or has a chance to escape, inferring that all the people living in Sector 7 slums were killed. But in Remake, by having Wedge sound the alarm and then giving all those NPCs the chance to escape, the tone of the plate fall was still tragic, but not so dark that you went to bed feeling like you just watched 3 hours of CNN. Speaking of the NPCs, they really helped with the tone in this game, I think. In the original, there are just very few people walking around the various locations, and the result is that everything just feels kind of lonely, dark, perhaps not even worth risking your lives for in some cases. But in Remake, there are NPCs everywhere. And while some of them are direct copies of each other, even sometimes right next to each other doing the exact same thing, they're actually diverse enough in look and motion to really amplify the energy of each location. So going back to Wall Market. In the OG, Wall Market is empty and it feels super sketch. But in Remake, it's sort of a fun town that doesn't take itself too seriously, like a Las Vegas that doesn't ruin people's lives. The use of NPCs completely changes the energy of locations throughout the game, and as a bonus, it's pure excellence that you don't have to push a button to talk to them. You just automatically overhear what they're saying when you're near them, which is a very appreciated mechanic, especially coming away from 15, where talk was the same button as jump. Remake also does a pretty decent job with humor.
You having fun yet?
Heaps.
And while some of the humor just falls flat, like every single cliche fat joke about Wedge,
I'm running on empty here. Even on an empty stomach. So long as someone looks out for my stomach. And I'm running on fumes. Think she'll make us pizza? You don't want me going to work on an empty stomach. Does this mean we're gonna ask some Shinra folks out to dinner? I get really hungry when I'm nervous. I'm feeling much better thanks to Elmira's cooking.
some of the other humor is actually pretty good.
I feel no fear. Yeah, no fear. No fear. No fear. No fear. Ooh, no fear. no fear. Hey guys, these fans are really loud and...
You chickening out?
Hell no! I'm just worried that your pony ass is gonna get blown off the side and shit.
I thought that Johnny guy was going to really annoy me when we first met him, but that guy ended up making me laugh.
Either of you know anything about cooking?
Nope, never cooked once. Drunkards, here we come. Leave it to me, old dude. For you, bro. For you. Because Cloud, you are my one true bro. The sauce.
The sauce?
Stop saying the sauce.
And then there are those other great little moments with characters and scenes that are either well written or just plain executed well. From the little proud smirks or the micro expressions from Cloud.
Okay, that was pretty cool.
Or when Cloud helps Tifa exit the train and then make sure that she's okay.
You okay?
Yeah.
I also really liked those evening interactions with various characters at Aerith's house, depending on which choices you make throughout the game. My favorite was definitely Aerith's.
And I'll always cherish what you've given me. But whatever happens, you can't fall in love with me. Even if you think you have, it's not real.
Do I get a say in all this?
It's almost morning. Time to go.
I'm coming for you.
If that's what you want. Thank you.
Also, the flashback of Cloud standing in the water. Oh man. We know what that one's all about, and there is some major opportunity to make that one seriously powerful scene. I mean, if it happens, which I guess we don't really know if it's going to happen, I still think it'll happen, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. And then there's the voice acting, something that as a filmmaker and a bit of an actor myself, I'm admittedly very picky about. So let me preface what I'm about to say by offering this. I understand that voice acting is still relatively new in the world of gaming, and it continues to improve over time. I mean, voice acting wasn't even in the original game, so it's a completely new element in Remake. Not just that, but the pure amount of voice recordings that have to be done to create a game of this size is nothing short of monumental, and there likely just isn't time to go back and nitpick every single line. This all being said, not all voice acting was created equal, at least in the English version of Remake, and there were even some moments that were, dare I say, a bit cringy. Let's consider our leading man first, okay? So I've heard people talk about how Cloud's performance was kind of flat, or he wasn't animated enough, and all that. And I would just say, wrong.
That makeup and that dress!
Nailed it. I know. Thank you. Moving on.
For me, Cloud was the best cast and best acted character in the game. His performance is natural and authentic, like a real person, for which I was so happy and relieved, because Cloud is not the character that developers want to screw up.
I'll buy you guys some time.
I can stay here, back you up.
Barrett. I'm asking you. Please.
If you think his acting is flat, that's probably because other characters are so over the top in contrast. But how else would you have Cloud act? He was smooth, confident, and all business. I wouldn't change anything about casting Cody Christian as Cloud. I think it was a good move. Another well-cast character was Barrett. Barrett's character is by nature completely over the top, and the only way to really pull that off with a voice actor is to cast someone who can still be authentic while being insanely animated at the same time. That's not necessarily an easy thing to do. Just acting loud and animated doesn't make you believable. But Squeenix made the right move casting John Eric Bentley as Barrett, because while he transitions from soft to loud to funny to gruff,
Making me worry like that. I'd kick your ass if you didn't look like shit.
You can feel that the actor is really putting himself in the character's shoes.
Marlene. Marlene! Marlene! Biggs! Wedge! Jesse! God damn it! God damn you! God damn you all! Marlene. Marlene.
Good acting isn't about pretending to feel or making your voice portray a certain emotion. It's about putting yourself in the moment and authentically feeling what the character would feel, and then letting the performance naturally follow. Anyone out there who knows anything about real good acting knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Put me on TV, I'm gonna drop some truth.
Along the same lines, Biggs is another solid character in the voice acting department,
Give me a bit more time and I got you.
which I guess shouldn't come as a surprise, given that he has a bajillion video game voice credits, including voicing one of the best characters in another familiar game.
I play the leading man. Who else?
Gideon Emery apparently couldn't stay away from the Final Fantasy series after voicing Balthier in Final Fantasy XII. Not that I blame him. Voicing a character in a Final Fantasy would be the absolute best thing ever, and I would die and go to the live stream if I got a piece of that action. And Gideon is just as relatable, natural, and likable as Biggs in Remake as he was as the Han Solo style Sky Pirate, and he probably is that same way in other swaths of characters he's played. There are a lot of other characters who also gave great acting performances, some you might not even expect. I thought Roche was really good. Wedge, Marlene the child actor, the Angel of the Slums, Johnny, Hojo, Madam M had some good moments, and even that wimpy guard NPC in Sector 7?
Excuse me? Due to an emergency, entry into this area is prohibited. Sorry for the inconvenience.
You called that a warning?
No, sir! In accordance with emergency regulations, entry into this area is prohibited. Please, leave at once.
Still too nice.
This area is off limits. Turn around and leave at once. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to use force.
Now you're getting the hang of it.
This really isn't a good time.
What was that? Do your job.
Yes, sir.
I gotta give props to all of them and anybody else who was awesome who I missed.
Very nice.
So I'm not stoked to talk about this because I really wanted every performance to be amazing. And I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but I don't know what was going on with my fellow females. But something was just a little bit off with the performances of many of the girl characters in this game.
Good job, Eric. It was nothing compared to you.
Before you yell at me or call me biased against my own gender or something, the female character performances weren't horrible. But when you're up against Cloud and Barrett and Biggs, anything lower than that high bar really stands out. Don't get me wrong, okay? I definitely do not think that female actors are inferior. In a lot of ways, I am one. It's gotta be a coincidence that the less convincing performances were female. Either that or the female characters were directed or maybe cast differently that resulted in a different style of performance. Let me explain. Again, my preferred style of acting is natural. Someone who is putting themselves in the scene authentically and then actually feeling the emotions of that character in that moment. At any point in time, if the voice actor starts thinking about how they're going to make their voice sound, instead of being in the moment and naturally feeling in a given scene, then the acting performance immediately takes a hit and the result is this sort of sing-songy line read.
And don't you forget it.
It can be animated, it can be passionate, but if the actor isn't feeling the character's emotion, it loses believability whether the viewer consciously notices or not. Even those who watch this may never notice unauthentic line reads, and that would be a blissful existence. But for those of us who work in entertainment, it's just part of the job to notice. Take Tifa, for instance.
What can I get you?
She is almost good. Her voice type and her timbre are spot on for Tifa, and I understand why she was cast just based on that alone. But throughout the game, I feel like the voice actor is partially putting herself in the scene, but then always has at least one toe out, where she's thinking about how she will say a line, making her sound a little sing-songy and indicative.
That really is it.
Now, this can also happen when a director feels the need to recite the way they'd like an actor to say a line, and then they make the actor repeat it back to them that exact same way, which is called line reading. But because her performance is pretty consistent throughout, my guess is that it's probably not the fault of the director, but more likely just part of her acting style. Though this is not to be confused with the actor who plays teenage Tifa, whose short performance was actually quite good.
Should have figured. All the guys are leaving.
And then there's Jessie. Now, Jessie kind of confused me. The voice actor is definitely committed, and she usually seems to believe her lines as long as she isn't laughing. So her performance should have worked for me, but something was just a little bit off, and then I figured out what it was. While she wasn't a bad actress, she just came across as being a cartoon character when I was hoping for a person I might actually meet in real life. For her, it didn't make her performance bad, it just didn't strike me as, wow, this girl is good for this role. It didn't match Cloud's realistic style, so I assumed that she probably had a lot of experience maybe voicing cartoons when I played the game, and so I looked her up online, and sure enough, I was exactly right.
Yep, right on the head.
And finally, there's Aerith.
It's Aerith.
I really like Aerith the character, and so I really wanted Aerith to have a performance as rockin' as Cloud's. But while Tifa was consistently sing-songy, Aerith bounced between being sing-songy,
ouch,
and being good.
But if he was telling the truth, and there's still a chance he was, isn't there? Then we should go.
Like when she was leaning into her bubbly side, sometimes it felt to me that the actress was just thinking, I need to be bubbly on this line.
We'll get home quick and eat ourselves stupid.
But when she calmed her voice for the more concerned or sincere scenes, she felt significantly more authentic to me because I could tell that she was really trying to put herself in the scene, and so I related to her much more in those moments. But while I wasn't an instant mega fan of her whole performance in Remake, I was much more forgiving of it after going back and playing the prequel Crisis Core, where Aerith is a breathy damsel with as much personality as an undergrown squash.
Wallet. Full of money? Never thought of it that way.
So, while Remake Aerith didn't ace the part for me, she didn't bomb it either.
That's supposed to be a compliment?
In fact, none of the female leads bombed their parts. The performances just didn't meet my highest hopes.
We make a great team.
Go team!
That said, there were definitely some character performances that all out sucked in this game. For the love of all that is wonderful in the world, it should be against the global developers' creed to allow adults to voice children characters in video games. Punch me in the friggin' face. Every Final Fantasy of the modern day does this, and it is always the absolute worst. Thank the heavens above, the main children characters in Remake, like Marlene, are voiced by authentic children who do a pretty good job, actually. But every time I listen to one of those orphanage kids open their mouth and speak with the voice of a 30-something-year-old female pretending to be a child,
Come on, help us!
There is no doubt that none of these children will ever be adopted.
And that'll be it.
None of this is the actor's fault, by the way. This is the fault of whoever decided to ask adults to pretend to be children. Hashtag fail, hashtag the worst, hashtag please make it stop. In fact, the casting was a bit all over the place. Some of the characters like Cloud and Biggs are cast as people you might meet and interact with at like school or at a grocery store. Kind of like Aloy from Horizon Zero Dawn or even Lara Croft from the newest version of Tomb Raider. The characters in those games feel human. And while some of the characters in Remake are also that way, others are just cast on the opposite end of the spectrum as completely cartoonish. So it feels weird to have them both together. Cartoonish like Heidegger or Miss Scarlet and Colonel Mustard from the game of Clue. It feels weird mixing these realistic with these cartoonish acting styles, But then again, this is the game where an anthropomorphic cat riding on a pink blob will eventually join Cloud's party, who we already caught this oddly timed sneak peek of during the collapse of the Sector 7 flight. That said, I thought the character writing was pretty good, including most of the dialogue, which was another thing that surprised me given who was directing this game.
Sephiroth is dead.
Yes, but has his mind died? What if he's somehow dissolved into the life stream, coursing through the planet undiffused?
And they topped it all off with, of course, that classically awkward Japanese grunting that Westerners have come to expect from pretty much every JRPG ever known. As for the combat, I was worried that I was going to hate it. So, having grown up as a big fan of turn-based systems, I'm always initially skeptical of other combat styles in a Final Fantasy, though admittedly I did end up enjoying the non-turn-based fighting in Final Fantasy XV, but parts of that combat system were a little clunky, and the magic system kind of sucked, and I ended up pretty much just beating most of the enemies by warp striking them to death. So, there's that. But the combat in Remake, however, was smooth and just pretty stellar. The way you mod your weapons without making previous weapons like the classic Buster Sword obsolete, though it does feel like you're kind of warping into Orion's belt from Men in Black. But you combine that system with how you pair up materia, it's just rockin' good. Limit break animations are as amazing as usual, and the new slow motion decision mechanic is a brilliant way to incorporate the feel of the old turn-based style while keeping things fresh and high energy. It's all just really well thought out. My only real complaint is that if you are interrupted while casting magic, you still lose MP even if you don't make the cast. What the heck? Has this ever been a thing in a Final Fantasy game? Having magic interrupted, okay, yes. But since when do you lose MP if you don't get to cast? A minor complaint, really, but at moments when MP is precious, it matters. And MP does matter when you're playing in hard mode. In fact, when you play in hard mode, everything good about the combat system is only magnified and just plain more fun. Suddenly, the more difficult challenge and the inability to use items forces you to make these well thought out strategic decisions with materia. You have to constantly switch characters and pay close attention to the enemy patterns and timing. It feels like it's how the game was truly meant to be played. So if you haven't played it on hard mode, it's time to load up the game right after you're done watching this video. Speaking of hard mode, I will tell you right now that hard mode Bahamut fight in Chadley's Final Simulator 3-person team versus top secrets challenge, where you fight 4 summon battles followed by some big robot, was the hardest friggin' battle in the game. I had to try it multiple times before I beat it, and each time I had to go through those annoying Shiva, Fat Chocobo, and Leviathan before I could even get to Bahamut to try again. But the Goddardammerung accessory that you get from completing that challenge, that allows you to start every single battle with the limit gauge full, made it completely worth it. Other bosses like Hell House and that big robot thing that Barret and Aerith fight with Red's help in Chapter 17, those killed me a time or two because I kept running out of MP, but that made it all the more satisfactory when I figured out the right strategy and came back to demolish them.
Then Cloud was all like, bam, bam, boom!
Your friend fought a house. A house?
Hard mode was just unexpectedly awesome. And every Final Fantasy connoisseur out there is very familiar with repetitive side quests. Remake definitely has its share of lame sauce side quests, the culmination being the search for little Betty's cat.
I'm looking for cats.
But at least they really leaned into the fact that they knew it was lame.
This sucks.
Although I will say that some of the battle-based side quests were challenging and actually kind of fun, while being more diverse than the other Final Fantasy installments. So I'd say the developers are on a good track. Also, fun fact. Remember the squats competition side quest at Jules' gym? Did you recognize the nod to the original game? In the OG, Cloud, who actually turns out to be Zack, busts out some mean squat action. probably because it's one of a limited number of animations that a polygon character can actually pull off. And then in Crisis Core, Zack is known for being a guy who loves to do squats throughout the game, also paying homage to the original. It's kind of fun. And there are other fun moments that are peppered throughout Remake that echoed the original game. When I first visited Wall Market in Remake, I was completely confused by that machine gun rigged arcade room that nearly kills you. It seemed to have no rhyme or reason to even exist, and it wasn't funny enough to be this standalone joke. Then, when I went back to play the original game, it all made sense when I encountered that exact scene inside Wall Market that I had apparently forgotten about. I love when developers take the time to put little Easter eggs in games for the very few who might actually catch on. And even though the entire Remake story takes place in this gray cemented city, the visuals in Remake were stunning. From the crumbling church to traveling by rooftop to Aerith's amazing house. Yes, slums my butt. It was all total eye candy. Okay, well, not all. They must have run out of time to render out better flowers because rather than just paying homage to the original game, those looked like they were pulled straight out of the original game. Shh. But really, the scenic designs throughout the game were imaginative, they didn't feel repetitive, and the lighting accentuated that beauty. I mean, did you notice how the light took a moment to adjust when you stepped outside? Just like our eyes and like cameras do, which was an awesome intentional touch. Although I was still confused as to why the Sector 7 slums were so blue looking when the Whispers came out in force. Calm down, you Smurfs. The cutscene camera movements also fit really well with the scenes, and I noticed this constantly. They were always moving when the scene motivated the movement, whether that was a physical motivation or an emotional motivation.
Where in the...
A stark contrast with Advent Children, where half of the movie is spent with these wingless characters somehow flying through the air while the camera zings around them like some fly in a blender until you have to push pause to vomit. How is this the same director? How? The camera even helps you know where to go after a battle by repositioning itself, looking in the right direction. And then there was the way that the cutscenes transitioned to gameplay so smoothly. Have you ever seen that executed so well?
Don't think so.
And then there's the physics engine, which I got way too excited about. Shinra clearly stores more cardboard boxes than Amazon. The whole game feels like this pile of autumn leaves set before a 7-year-old. Yeah, so every box feels empty, and the metal beams and the picnic tables don't seem to leave a scratch on you. But physics engines are still evolving, and it entertained me way more than it should have. And whoever out there was responsible for the park swings, you get a verbal trophy from me. It didn't matter if it was some solemn moment in the story, if the swings are around, they needed to be played with. Though sadly they didn't quite move in the same way in other games. And the sound design is also a big step up for a Final Fantasy. And while not perfected yet, the sound effects, the timing, and the mixing in these games is getting better and better. I mean, just take a look at this clip from the Final Fantasy that came before this one. Though I was disappointed in the music. I was disappointed only in that the massive near 200-track soundtrack didn't include this beautiful rendition of Aerith's theme. I'm also disappointed that a blasted global pandemic postponed the Final Fantasy Remake orchestral concert that I have tickets for. I was really looking forward to going to, though I probably shouldn't complain given that my pandemic-induced circumstances could be much worse. I mean, honestly, who could really be disappointed with Final Fantasy music? It's always phenomenal, and Final Fantasy VII is no exception. Aerith's theme is iconic, and we get to hear it peppered throughout Remake, and that moment in Chapter 2 when the battle music first kicks in. As far as I'm concerned, Nobuo Uematsu is one of modern day's most talented composers, and he really gave the Remake team something incredible to build on. Though I can't really say the same thing about the music in Crisis Core.
Not my style.
And while there definitely is a lot to like in Final Fantasy VII Remake, every game has things to dislike.
It's fine just the way it is.
Here are a few of the things that I wasn't in love with. Cursing. You're gonna call me old-fashioned, but there is a butt-ton of cursing in this game.
You greedy bastard! Scum-sucking piece of shit-festering asshole!
One reason I don't love that is because of this. I have a 1-year-old kid, and if the first installation of this game doesn't even leave Midgar, then we're on track to have a solid couple decades more of these games ahead of us, which means trying to hide the audio from my kid basically throughout his entire childhood. And even if you're 17 years old now and you think I'm being some old fart by worrying about the swearing, there's a good chance that you'll grow up and have your own kids long before we see the conclusion of the remake story, and then we'll see how you feel. Cloud leaving the door open at Jessie's house. Shut the dang door! You sneak into Jessie's house, into her comatose dad's room even, you take his stuff, and then you quietly sneak back out, but then you leave the door wide open? All that work just to give away the fact that the house was invaded because you didn't shut the door. Potato sack ghosts. I get the idea that they have to take on a physical form of some kind so that we can chop it with a sword and all. But potato sacks? I don't know, I think that keeping them translucent spirits that could be penetrated by attacks would have been much more creepy and interesting. Just a little thought. Chapter 6. That chapter where you have to go around turning off the big lights is the slowest moving part of the game. And it was made worse because despite the giant digital map, I just kept getting lost.
You taking a detour?
And since I hate mazes and getting lost with a fiery passion, I'm not going to sing the praises of Chapter 6.
Where could they be going? Embarking on an adventure to find some treasure?
That said, it was still a step up from boring chapters of past Final Fantasies, so really, this barely makes it onto the dislike list, but here it is.
So long, Underplate. I hate you too.
Kyrie. Oh my gosh, was she annoying in every way. Topped off with another ridiculous cartoon acting performance. Please, no more Kyrie in upcoming games. The mystery drink. Did this have a purpose or affect anything whatsoever? Because if it did, I completely missed it. Minigames. I'm not generally a minigame fan because they typically throw you into new mechanics without giving you time to master them. And thankfully, there weren't a ton of minigames in Remake, and the ones that were there did help diversify the gameplay, which I can conceptually appreciate. But those levers... Seriously, did anyone think, dang, this is so much fun when they were trying to time Barrett and Cloud and Tifa's levers?
I think I should lead after all. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
Much better.
It wasn't until I went back to the original game and realized that the lever pull was brought over to Remake directly from the OG. So that still made it annoying, but much more forgivable. So, speaking of minigames, there are so many of them in the original Final Fantasy VII, and some of them are ultra awkward. Like a hilarious lengthy snowboarding game where physics need not apply, a submarine sonar game that brought me straight back to my original Atari days and not in a good way, and my personal favorite, not favorite, a minigame where you literally have to press the right buttons to give CPR to a drowned child. We'll have to see if that one makes it into future editions of Remake. The hand massages. I actually like Madame M. I thought she was interesting, funny, and decently acted. That said, I wasn't in love with some of the attempts at sexual humor in the game involving her hand massages. While the massages weren't even a fraction as risque as content published in other games these days, some were too uncomfortably awkward, though maybe that's what they were going for.
A cry of pleasure.
Still, I would recommend to Square Enix that they stick to classic teen-rated content, as they really don't seem to know how to flirt with what's beyond that in a JRPG. Which reminds me of something. Apparently, Final Fantasy XVI will be rated mature, which, while that may excite some people, I, shocker, have the opposite reaction. Final Fantasy fans typically appreciate the series' lighter tones, even on darker themes. We buy into magic and summoning, like we buy into the live stream and monsters turning into orbs of light after they've been killed or KO'd. It's called Final Fantasy, not final bloody execution of death, murder, splatters, revenge. If we wanted blood and gore and dark storytelling, we could play just about any other game out there not made for Nintendo. The other day I watched my husband literally rip a man in half in all its gore while he was testing out God of War, a rated M game recommended by a friend, and neither of us could continue playing after that despite the interesting story and the mechanics. We just aren't into that stuff. Give me back my Final Fantasy games where 8-foot swords knock people out.
We need to go before they wake up.
So, developers of Final Fantasy XVI and others in the series, a little blood here or there that happened to push you just past a teen rating, fine, but don't fall into the trap of adding that stuff just to titillate a new audience. Don't lean so far into mature content that you fall out of line with what makes the series so popular. That's not what Final Fantasy has ever been. And as far as I know, no one has been asking for it to be that way. Okay, soapbox over.
Ought to come with a warning. That ain't for kids.
And then there are those awkward moments in Remake, like the cartoonish passengers on the bus, or the end of that one side quest where you clear out the monsters in front of that old widow man's wife's grave, and then you ask for money to help him again.
It'll cost you 5,000 gil, though.
5,000?
It's always money with you people.
I think that Cloud was asking for money in order to motivate the old man to act and give him something to live for, but it played more like Cloud was just a jerk, which was a little too extreme for him at that point in the story. And after the plate drops in Sector 7 and Barrett spends quite a few minutes lamenting Marlene's death.
Marlene!
If only there was someone nearby who knew Marlene was safe. Oh wait, there are 2 of them right next to him. But they just watch Barrett mourn the loss of his daughter for what feels like an eternity before someone finally steps in with a, "Oh, I forgot to mention, that girl is still alive." Shouldn't that be the first thing that you say, like the moment you can open your mouth? And there were other moments that were just cringy. And while there are some things to dislike, there's also a very long list of things to like in this game. For instance, you can save whenever you want. Hallelujah! So often in Final Fantasies you have to find a save crystal or be on the world map to save, but not in Remake. Good call. Another good call was that other than my pathetic inability to navigate Chapter 6...
You know the best way to not get lost is to believe that you're not.
There were no annoying mazes or ridiculous puzzles. Some people are fans of that stuff, but for me, they're an annoying waste of time. Especially mazes that you can't save in, which are plentiful in Final Fantasy dungeons, and always my least favorite parts. And behold, both of these annoyances were eliminated in Remake, which made me very happy.
Yes!
And then, like it or hate it, there's the ending of Remake to talk about. And this is where the plot took some liberties that none of us really expected. But to really evaluate the ending, we need to revisit the original game once again. So when I went back to play the original Final Fantasy VII, it took me about 6 hours to play the portion of the story represented in Remake, compared to the more than 60 hours I put into my first round of Remake. That means that Remake consisted of 10% of my gameplay of the original game. And if they continue at that pace, we'll see 9 more parts of Remake be released before we reach the end of the original story. And that honestly can't be possible. I mean, my guess is that they moved more slowly in part 1 so that they could really focus on building the characters and setting up the story, which I actually appreciate. And then they'll move a little faster afterwards, maybe. Or maybe the next parts will be longer games, letting you level up to 100 instead of 50 like other Final Fantasies, and cover more of the story in a single SKU. Or maybe they'll veer away from the original story completely and write their own that wraps up in like 3 games or something. I guess we'll just have to see. But in the original game, the story is pretty much the same as Remake, except a lot less attention is given to Avalanche characters Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, who die almost as quickly as they're introduced. In Remake, we really get to know these characters before they supposedly die, so their deaths are more meaningful. Also, Sephiroth isn't really introduced during this part of the original game, whereas flashes of him were understandably added throughout Remake, or, I mean, nobody would know anything about him going into part 2 otherwise. There's also theories that Sephiroth is actually playing a role in changing fate, but I guess we'll find out if that's legit. And then there's the really big difference between these 2 games. These guys. Nowhere in the original game do these whispers exist. And that's because they seemingly act as guardians of fate. Or in other words, they try to do everything in their power to make sure that Remake stays on the same story path as the original game did. Every time they show up, they either save or they hurt someone in the same way it came to pass in the OG. They even bring Barrett back to life after he's killed in the president's office, because Barrett doesn't die in the original story. And then in the end, when these whispers really come out in force, the final chapter suddenly turns the story away from the original, with Cloud and Aerith and their team fighting these arbiters of fate in hopes of actually changing what fate will be. Which, say what now? And since our party defeats fate at the end of Remake, it suddenly leaves the door open for the rest of the story to take its own path away from the original. It even confirms the path is different, because who do we see walking with Cloud instead of laying dead on the rocks but Zack Fair himself, the very character who started this whole series of events, who, according to the original game and the prequel Crisis Core, should have been killed in a final battle with Shinra soldiers, not walking around. So does that mean he's still alive? But wouldn't that have changed the whole story up until this point? Or is this an alternative dimension now?
Somewhere in the past, the timeline skewed into this tangent, creating an alternate 1985.
All of this to me was a completely brilliant move on the developers' part, pending that they don't screw it up later. Suddenly they've managed to keep what we all love about the original intact, while simultaneously making us scratch our heads and wonder what in the world is going to happen next. They delivered the best of both worlds, classic Final Fantasy VII mixed with new. Now, even original fans don't know what's coming next. I mean, when Barrett was stabbed, I was like, wait, what? And I suddenly was thinking maybe I didn't understand the game like I thought I did. And not only were we left with questions about what will happen next, and if characters like Zack and Biggs are actually alive, but we have an even bigger question. What is going to happen to Aerith? You know exactly what scene I'm talking about. Aerith's death scene is one of the most unexpected, emotional, and well-known moments in video game history, even being referenced in pop culture movies like Wreck-It Ralph. And now we're suddenly faced with the question of if that iconic moment is actually going to happen at all. We think we saw a brief flash forward of it in Cloud's mind during Remake, but that was before Fate was defeated, so really who knows? So this question, and many others, remain. If I had to guess, I think that Cloud and the team will probably continue to follow the same basic storyline of the original game, visiting maybe the same OG landmarks and cities with more fleshed out story and a few turns here or there. It's my personal belief that Aerith will still probably die somehow, possibly at a different time or place as a self-sacrifice for the greater good. Maybe Zack, who could be alive, dies too. Maybe the two of them are united in death. But then again, anything could happen. Maybe different events are unfolding simultaneously in different dimensions or something. I mean, I highly doubt they're going to end the game with different characters alive than were alive at the end of the OG. But then again, Stamp is now a Yorkie, so anything can happen.
Why does everything have to be so damn complicated?
I just hope they don't screw it up.
Pretty please.
If I could give the developers any advice, I would plead with them to make sure the story is fleshed out clearly. They can do whatever they feel is best with it, but it needs to make sense, and it needs to play by the rules it sets up for itself, as opposed to maybe just making up rules on the fly. And if we're all left scratching our heads in confusion about unanswered questions when the final installment concludes, that will be a big fat fail.
Not good.
But after playing the first installation of the remake story, I'm hopeful and cautiously optimistic that the developers will make good decisions. But then I'm reminded that the same director also made this. Oh, Advent Children. The movie sequel to Final Fantasy VII, where Cloud fights a random silver-haired trio who kidnaps children during, ironically, a global pandemic. In the end, the silver trio somehow resurrects a version of Sephiroth, who Cloud must fight yet again. My opinion? Advent Children sucks. Not for its animation, which was actually pretty advanced at the time, but because it took any arc that Cloud went through in the game and royally bulldozed it.
I'm not fit to help anyone.
Critics have described the storyline in Advent Children as being, quote, incomprehensible to anyone who didn't play the original game. That is completely false. Advent Children was incomprehensible to everyone, regardless of if they played the original game or not. I doubt even the screenwriters really understood what was going on while they were writing the words of the script. The script sucks.
Dilly-dally, shilly-shally.
The story sucks. The characters suck. The few attempts at humor suck. The camera movement sucks. Barrett's fishnet shirt, what is that all about? It sucks. There are no bright moments to juxtapose against all the dark tones, making the movie very one-note and dull. And any honest human who watches it can see that the whole reason that it was made was just to show off a Cloud versus Sephiroth fight with better CGI. And in the process, it basically undoes everything that happened in the original game, which is the biggest sin of all. Sephiroth returns, Jenova is still wreaking havoc, Midgar life isn't much different, Shinra and the Turks are still around, and as for Cloud, the leadership qualities, the humanistic characteristics, acceptance of his past, and carefully crafted relationships, all developed in the main game, are basically just wiped out, reverting Cloud back to a reclusive loner who goes by the beat of his own drum and leaves Tifa and others in the lurch.
You don't care?
Bad, bad, bad. I mention all this because when it comes to Final Fantasy VII Remake, the best thing they can do is to use their new Defying Fate plot twist to completely decanonize Advent Children, or at least make the alternative timeline come with an alternative sequel potential or something. While there are a couple cool moments in Advent Children,
Pops! Park us over by the rocks. Cloud, right's over.
The work as a whole is simply story garbage that hurts the Final Fantasy brand, and it leaves a million more questions, like why certain characters are apparently impervious to death. I mean, Cloud is literally both stabbed and shot through the heart twice as deadly as what originally killed the last living Cetra, but no big deal. And then there was this moment with Rude and Reno, but then a few minutes later, here they are. And why does it end with a giant baptismal ceremony in the church? And while we're talking about crappy additions to Final Fantasy VII canon, now is a good time to mention the third-person shooter game, Dirge of Cerberus. While not as painful as Advent Children, it's not a good story addition either. Vincent Valentine may be an interesting character with a potentially interesting backstory, but that story is just not fleshed out very well in Dirge. In the original Final Fantasy VII, if you pick up Vincent as a character and investigate more about him, you learn that he's actually a former Turk who is now basically some sort of creature, constantly in mourning of what happened to his long-lost love, who was this woman named Lucretia, who, get this, apparently chose to shack up with this guy instead of with Vincent.
Excuse me?
Consequently, she ends up getting pregnant and gives birth to a Genova cell-injected baby named Sephiroth, who is taken away from her at birth. Oh, and Lucretia accidentally killed Vincent's dad too. So, you know, typical plot lines. In Dirge, which takes place a year after Advent Children, we flash back to scenes between Lucretia and Vincent, and where they had ample opportunity to be emotionally enticing, they fall incredibly flat. Never is the love story between Vincent and overactor Lucretia ever believable.
Why are you so surprised? Is my face that hideous?
And just like Advent Children, Dirge of Cerberus feels like it was made to basically just show more of a popular character with a solid, already created fan base that might spend money to see it. The result is another convoluted plot that manages to further complicate some of the things we've seen before. Deep Ground is the new Shinra, Omega is the new weapon, and Hojo has been promoted to be the new Sephiroth, since, you know, bringing Sephiroth back again would be crossing the line. Original characters like Cloud and Tifa all make only brief appearances, which is good, because the longer they're in this game, the higher the chances are that I will hate how they're represented. Oh, and there's a lot of evil laughing. Though, I guess that's pretty consistent with all of the Final Fantasy VII content. Anyway, don't play it. Hopefully, with the decanonizing of Advent Children, they can also kill off Dirge of Cerberus.
That's the plan.
But that's not to say that everything in the Final Fantasy story canon is worth ignoring completely. Another piece of this plot puzzle, as I've mentioned, is Crisis Core. Released after Final Fantasy VII, Crisis Core was created to build on the Zack Fair flashbacks from the original game, and to show how Cloud fit into the picture and became who he was. And maybe I'm alone on this, or at least I'm one who dares to admit it, but when I finished playing the original Final Fantasy VII as a teenager, I was quite confused as to who was a clone of what, and when they became clones, and how and why they were clones of the clones of the clones of Attack of the Clones, blah, 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 blah. So playing Crisis Core was actually a way to fill in some of the gaps in the original Final Fantasy VII flashback scenes. Only released on PSP, you play as Zack Fair, and you get to play through years of key moments like earning his first-class soldier rank, acquiring the Buster Sword, and seeing Sephiroth go from war hero to insane, murderous maniac. You see Zack's budding romance with Aerith, and later befriend Cloud, this wussy grunt who's easily plagued by motion sickness, who isn't even close to soldier rank. We get to see how the two guys individually attempt to stop Sephiroth from taking Genova and destroying the planet, ultimately leading to a true act of heroism from the low-ranking Cloud, where he sacrifices himself to throw Sephiroth to his supposed death, where he actually doesn't die. And then we see how Zack and Cloud were carried off and injected with Genova cells in experiments. something that barely apparently affected Zack because he's a soldier, but potentially both saves regular human Cloud's life and simultaneously turns him into this messed up vegetable. And then from there, Cloud pretty much spends the rest of the game unconscious, with Zack carrying him around trying to save both of their lives as fugitives venturing back to Midgar under pursuit of Shinra. The game ends just outside the Midgar walls, where this massive Shinra army catches up to them, and then Zack loses his life protecting Cloud. Just as Zack lays there dying, Cloud finally finds the strength to stand, and Zack tells him that Cloud will now be Zack's living legacy. Cloud takes up the Buster Sword and ventures into Midgar, where he'll hire on with Avalanche to help blow up the first Mako reactor at the start of Final Fantasy VII, thinking that Zack's past is actually a part of his past. Okay, a few thoughts about Crisis Core. I honestly wasn't stoked to play through it because I had assumed that if it was a good game, I would have either heard more about it or at least it would have been released on something other than a single handheld console. But I gave it a try anyway, and I'm glad I did. It's not perfect. The voice acting is bad.
Oh, you.
Though that was probably more of the fault of the time it was developed than the actors in this case. And the dialogue and parts of the plot are not written very well.
No story is not worth hearing.
With virtually no NPCs, the scenes also feel just about as empty as the original Final Fantasy VII. And while story moments surrounding Zack, Cloud, Aerith, and Sephiroth are really interesting and they make the game worth playing, other plot lines are just terrible. For instance, much of the story surrounds a trio of skilled friends in Soldier. Sephiroth, Genesis, and then Zack's mentor Angeal, who I think is ridiculously named to lean too far into this one-winged angel concept. Sephiroth is really interesting, but the game never gives a reason to emotionally invest in Angeal or Genesis. Both of them defect from Soldier toward the beginning of the game, and then they wreak havoc across the land by creating a bunch of weird clone people and clone monsters. Yes, more clones. Everyone's cloning each other and pretending to be clones of other people, and some have degenerating tissue, but others don't. None of it is terribly clear. Even the director of Soldier, clearly a beta version of Ignis Ciencia, turns into a clone of a clone of a clone. I don't know. And then this Genesis guy, who looks more like a pretty girl, speaks in this Shakespeare wannabe prose from the apparently famous play Loveless that we see advertised on the Sector 8 theater in Final Fantasy VII.
Even if the morrow is barren of promises, nothing shall forestall my return.
Talk like a normal person! These plots are hard enough to figure out without your attempts at fantastical old English. And to top it off, the backstory behind the Buster Sword is revealed to be a real letdown.
That sword represents our family's honor.
I see.
While the combat is basically just button mashing, top with slot machine gambling at random moments to pump you up with extra HP or summons, it's actually kind of fun to play. But the best parts about the game were the interactions with the characters we know from Final Fantasy VII. Seeing how Cloud and Zack got to know each other is just too much fun, and inarguably the best part about Crisis Core.
Cloud.
You also interact with Tifa and her weird cowgirl outfit, Yuffie as a little girl if you play some of the side missions, and then you even come across Vincent sleeping in his coffin. And spending time with Sephiroth before he flips a gasket and goes sociopathic is fascinating, and it adds this layer of depth to his character. So that stuff is all delightful nerd candy for fans. Though, unfortunately, Aerith in Crisis Core completely lacks the spark she has in other games. She both talks and she runs like this prissy wuss.
I planted some outside my house, too.
And she even complains about the flower cart that Zack spends forever building for her.
Not quite what I expected.
Really? I think it's fine. It's all about the flowers anyway.
I want a nicer one.
Stop being so picky.
A tiny little wish. That's all.
You live in the slums and hang out in a dilapidated church. Be grateful for your cart. And then there's Zack. While his dialogue is usually lame, Zack is actually a pretty likable and heroic character.
Hello to you too!
Unlike Cloud, who we know is being stoic and cocky about his supposed soldier skills, Zack is open and fun-loving and authentically able to kick the crap out of everyone. As cheesy as it is, when you see Zack trying to talk down his opponents before he fights them, carry and defend an unconscious Cloud for months, and then face down an entire army knowing he would probably be killed trying to protect his friend, you start to wish that there were a lot more people like him in real life.
The price of freedom is steep.
To sum up Crisis Core, I actually had a lot more fun with that game than I ever expected, so it gets a thumbs up from me.
Embrace your dreams.
I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the short anime film Last Order, which basically consists of bloodier snippets of the Crisis Core story surrounding Zack and Cloud. It doesn't introduce much different content, except that it does show Shinra taking the unconscious Zack and Cloud into the Shinra Mansion basement to be experimented upon, as well as a few other small details. One differentiation is that it shows Sephiroth purposefully jump off the ledge with Genova's head, rather than being thrown off by a heroic Cloud. Something that seems to contradict all the other games and lore, and honestly isn't nearly as impactful in my opinion. So we'll just have to see how future remake episodes handle that one. Okay, so that's the universe of Final Fantasy VII canon, at least in the United States. After going back and playing these as well as the original game, I'm really looking forward to seeing how a lot of the elements play out in future editions of Remake. I'm interested in seeing Barrett's tragic backstory and the story behind Marlene. While I'm not stoked for the Gold Saucer, which will probably be the land of annoying minigames, I do want to see Cloud and Aerith go on a date and be pulled up on stage to help act in the play. And I'm excited to see Junon and other iconic locations and characters. And then I can't help but wonder just how they're going to handle scenes like this. Dang. I also think it would be cool if Marlene was a long-lost Cetra. And of course, I'm most interested to see how Cloud and his story are fleshed out. I mean, how much are we going to see of Zack? In fact, how much is going to be different given the whole defeating fate thing? Are they going to be able to make the ending make sense and pay off? Squeenix, okay, you've done a good job of getting me excited for the next installment, so please don't make us wait another 5 years. Or do, if it means that rushing it will make it suck. So, I mean, if you can't tell, Final Fantasy VII Remake was a win in my book. It hit the right story moments, built up the characters, it kept the charm of the original, and it still managed to be new. And while it was still imperfect, it was unconventionally and incredibly well polished for an RPG, let alone a Final Fantasy, and I am all the more excited to see what is coming next. So please, Square Enix, don't let us down. Let's keep a good thing going. Thanks for watching, Mom. Feel free to drop me a line in the comments if you agree or if you disagree with any part of this review, because chances are high I will read it and respond. See you here again after the next installment. The original game first had her named as Aerith, but then Japan changed it to Earth.
Fail.
Aerith's authenticity and Aerith's authenticity, cartoonist The journey to remake began. Uh-oh, I've got notifications on. I need to be bubbly on this line! I looked into the light, now I can't see. I'm blind! Slow down of pace at the train graveyard, as though as though everybody has to go potty. After playing the prequel, Crisis Core, after playing the prequel, gonna be so late because I can't see the English. To humor moments and so on and